My name's Yolanda. I'm in the last year of my PhD. I have been over with QT for a little while, and I've just transferred to UQ. This is like my first time here, so it's exciting, but I have been in Cairns doing fieldwork for the last 6 months or so, going out to the reef. So my research is, before I go into today's presentation, which is not so much about my research, it's more like a bit of an introduction to a lot of the theory and the kind of ideas behind my research questions. My research looks at climate communication in the context of the reef and how we can talk about it in a way that motivates meaningful action on climate change. And a lot of that is based around how people connect to reefs, how people respond to information about environmental issues, particularly complex ones. There's a lot of different messages people get about the Great Barrier Reef in terms of threats to it, what's being done to protect it, what's not being done. So that's kind of the space that I work in. And the project I've just finished was interviewing and surveying tourists on tourism boats as they go out to the reef and seeing whether the experience of the Great Barrier Reef does influence behavior. So a lot of people assume that it does. Go out into nature, it makes you want to protect it. And so the presentation today is just kind of a primer into environmental conservation psychology. I don't know if it's something many people are familiar with or not. Not really sure what the school does. I'm pretty sure it does a lot of different things. So this might be something new or not. Before I continue, I just want to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yugara as the traditional owners of the land that we're on, as well as the Gimwe, Wullabari, Yidinji and the Irukandji people, where most of my work's been conducted, as well as all the First Nations owners who have watched the Great Barrier Reef for centuries. Okay, so you can fight me on this later, but when it comes to environmental problems, we no longer have a problem of science. What I mean by that is, to a large extent, we know exactly what's happening. Whether it's climate change, biodiversity loss, we know things are bad and they're probably going to get worse. Importantly, we do know what happens if we do nothing. So it's not really a problem of science anymore. We also know the solutions. We know the steps that need to be taken to avert worst case scenarios. That stuff is more or less out there in the world. What we have now is a problem of communication and human behavior. We need those solutions that we already know exist to be done. We need someone to do them, someone to make decisions, someone to implement them. We need people, whether it's individuals and communities like ourselves doing things. And I don't mean just turning off your lights. I mean actively putting public pressure on decision makers, whether it's engaging actively politically, individuals and communities, businesses, corporations, governments, anyone. All this really comes down to a problem of what we do or what we don't do going into the future. Because of this, a lot of my work is in the context of individuals. How can we motivate individuals to really get these solutions going, right? How can we engage socially? How can we engage politically? How can we help make these things happen? And so I look at that in the context of coral reefs. I look specifically at climate change and climate action, but a lot of this applies to any kind of environmental action, also not even just coral reefs, just biodiversity conservation more generally. A lot of people have realized that, okay, what we need to do now is engage people, get the power of the people, get everyone motivated, aware what's happening to coral reefs, how can we stop it? So you might have seen lots of things like these before. Raising awareness campaigns, public engagement, education, outreach initiatives. A lot of them might look like this, right? Things that, what's happening to reefs? They're bleaching. Why? What are the problems? What can you do? You would have seen lots of these 10 ways to protect reefs. Here's 12 things you can do at home. And a lot of these aim to raise awareness. You've also got a lot of other reef kind of projects and initiatives that do also have a goal of raising awareness to some extent. It might not be their main goal, but a lot of these things do have public education or raising awareness as part of their program. So reef restoration, I'm talking about it in terms of those more community, small scale, maybe tourism-based restoration projects that you can do. If you go out on one of the boats on the reef, you can watch what happens. You can maybe learn about it a bit more. Underwater art, you've got citizen science like the reef census, which is happening now. If anyone's up on the reef, they need volunteers. Or your conservation dive courses, your PADI, Project Aware. All of them do have underlying goals of engaging the public, teaching them a bit about coral reefs, maybe raising awareness about reef conservation. which is great. But a lot of them work on this underlying assumption. I think a lot of people do. And it's a really nice thing to think might be true. So you might have read a quote like this around at some point: we cannot protect something we do not love, we cannot love something we do not know, and we cannot know what we do not see, right? So it's this idea of you have to see it, you have to know it, you have to care, and then you do something. Unfortunately, to burst this bubble, it doesn't work that way. And a lot of those things I just showed you before, they do really rely on this. If we just tell them about reefs, if we just show them what's happening, if we get them engaged, then they will love it and they'll take action. That's the assumption that a lot of them take. And a lot of them don't actually measure whether that's happened. They just throw it out into the air and hope that it's raised awareness, for example. So this is jumping back a little bit. This is thinking about what is raising awareness? Like, what does that actually mean? What does it look like? This here is kind of a model for what we call for public engagement, but public engagement, not as a process, not like stakeholder engagement, public engagement as an outcome. And you can think of engaging people in 3 different ways. We call this the minds, hearts, and hands model. You can engage people with their minds, right? That is your awareness, that is increasing knowledge. It can be knowledge of a problem, can be knowledge of the solution, right? So that's your mind's component. You've also got a heart's component, which is engaging on an emotional level. It's personally connecting with issues, or it's called caring or being concerned about something. Then you've got hands, and that's our behavioral engagement. That is, oh, it doesn't, that shouldn't say awareness, knowledge, and problems down the bottom. That should say action. That is actually doing something, physically doing something. Now people think that it looks like this, that knowing leads to caring, leads to action. It would be really lovely if humans actually did that. But it turns out we're a lot more complex, and the pathways that determine our behaviors, any behavior, but in this case, environmental behaviors, it can look a little bit more like this. These are just 4 examples. You don't have to read them. They're just to show you that it's really complicated. These are 4 kind of key models that I use and look at, but there are plenty more. And you can see there is a lot more than awareness, concern, and behavior in there. For example, in the first one there, that's the theory of planned behavior, which is a very popular, it's quite an old behavioral theory, and it's based on beliefs. So beliefs on what you think of the behavior itself. Is it a good or bad thing to do? What you believe other people are doing, what you think other people approve of you doing. And if you believe you can actually do it, and if you believe that you doing it will have an impact. So there's not really any awareness or concern in that one. Protection motivation theory is kind of getting there. It's when knowledge, use your knowledge, and whether you take action depends on whether you perceive a threat personally and how severe you perceive that threat to be, but also whether you think you can avert that threat, whether you can do something that will change it, right? If you feel capable, if you feel you have self-efficacy. Down the bottom, value belief norm theory is probably the closest to that awareness, concern, behavior. Awareness of consequences, ascription of responsibility is just kind of having that moral obligation to do something, a personal sense of I should do something to protect whatever, and that leads to behavior. But all of that is informed by those values on that right-hand side there. So whether your values are more open to change or whether you have more conservative values about anything, just worldviews. And then this one here, this theory of normative social behavior is saying that your behaviors are determined by what society does and what everyone else is doing or perceives you are doing and things like that. In some of these, there's awareness in there. There is concern and emotion in there. There's also variations of all these models, which include more of those things. But you can see here that there's so many things that go into whether we take action or not. And so when it comes to raising awareness, what of this are we targeting? Is the goal to actually raise awareness? Do you want just people to know about something more? Or is the point of raising awareness to get people to take action? If that's the case, approaches need to look a little bit different. Some examples. So climate change in the reef, because that's where my work is. These are examples from a few different papers of national surveys over the last 5 or 6 years. 2016 was ages ago. 7 years, but the numbers are actually higher now. So Australians concerned about the impact of climate change on the reef, 77%. I would say awareness is not too bad. Australians that believe we are responsible for the health of the reef, that's some personal norm, some moral obligation to do something. Australians recognise climate change as one of the greatest threats to the reefs, 76%. So awareness and concern are quite high. But then another survey, and this is about 4,000 Australians, that one should say 8%. When asked what can you do to help protect the reef, despite those three at the top there, only 8% could actually connect protecting the reef with something they could do, like in climate action. And less than 5% could list a very specific action that they could do to help. So that's a huge gap. And this is what we call an attitude action gap, right? So people are quite aware, they're concerned, they're like, I know something's happening, but there's this, it's not leading to action currently. Another example on the reef, so this is me doing my surveys, I've just got all the results back. And this is just to give an idea that it looks, because this is this year, so what it looks like now, people going to see the reef. Almost 90% on the boat said that yes, they had thought about environmental issues during the day, and most of those people could recognize climate change, warming water, bleaching, that kind of things happening to the reef. Concern for the reef was super high. Most people gave at least an 8 out of 10 on a scale for concern about the reef. And I think that's because a lot of people have seen the news, everyone's like, the reef's dying. So there's a lot of concern already there about the Great Barrier Reef. But when asked, do they think individuals could help the reef? And if so, what could they do? Less than 10% could list an action that they could help that was related to climate mitigation. And I was being nice in this 10%. I included things that were like mitigate climate change. If you're going specific actions where people said, I could vote for this person, or I could reduce my carbon footprint by X, less than 6%. So that knowledge, concern, action gap is still happening on the reef. So what do we do about it? Well, I guess what I've got some considerations, I suppose, for if you're going out there and you want to raise awareness about the reef, what to really think about and what your goals are, and how you can make those things, which I'm hoping everyone, the ultimate goal is to make people take action, how you can make it lead to action. The first thing would be to actually think about what you want. What specifically do you want people to know, feel, or do as a result of whatever it is? If it's a public campaign, if it's a reef restoration program where you want to engage people with reef conservation, if it's whatever it is, if one of your goals is to raise awareness about the reef, what do you mean? Raise awareness, okay. Why? Firstly, why raise awareness? Second, what does that look like? You know, do you just want, you can measure these things. Do you just want 1 out of 5 people to be able to say, yes, climate change is affecting the reef and this is what's happening? What do you want it to look like? Or is your goal not to actually raise awareness, but to raise awareness so that people change their behavior? If that's the goal, that's very, very different. Changing behavior, you saw all those variables before, and there's research out there on how you can target some of those things, like social norms, for example. You can kind of influence people by emphasizing what others are already doing. You know, if your goal is to change behavior, you really need to consider which behavior. For example, if you tell people to use less energy at home, that's very different to if you want everyone to go to a climate protest, for example. Choose your behavior as well. Just being specific. Same with if you just want to kind of make people feel more connected. If you just want to take people out to the reef, make them connect with marine life and just leave it there. Is that your goal? Or is your goal to get them to take action? Really consider, because those 3 things are separate, right? They're linked, but they're separate. That would be the first thing. Second one, know your target audience. A lot of behavioral, environmental psychology and behavior a lot of it's based on marketing, right? Know your audience. If you want them to do a thing, you need to know who you want to do the thing. There's no such thing as a general public, right? You can't just target everyone. You need to know your person. For example, we've done a study this year about plastic messaging, and we've found that plastic messages influence people differently depending how engaged they already are with ocean issues. So depending on their interest levels already in marine conservation, marine biology, things like that. So you can define your audiences by obviously demographics or context, but also circumstances, interests, beliefs. Knowing your audience can really help you target them for whatever behavior thing you want them to do, right? And you can also start to consider, well, what might be barriers for that audience in doing this thing? What can we leverage? What can we how can we help enable them to do this behavior? Really understanding your audience is really important. Number 3, talk about solutions. This sounds really obvious, but no one does it. Everyone talks about the impacts and the problems and then goes, be more sustainable. Vague, really vague calls to action don't actually work very well. Most people kind of know, yeah, I should be more sustainable to help the environment, but that doesn't really process into actions that people can tangibly take. So talk about meaningful and effective ways people can get involved. And we don't mean like a checklist to turn off your lights, reuse your plastic bottles. Most people are quite aware of those things. They either already do them or don't. But most people actually don't believe that those things will have a big enough impact, right? They don't see that really solving these large, huge global environmental issues. They're like, well, what can I actually do? So providing meaningful solutions and also focusing on things that are more about the collective than the individual. Some of our research and other researchers found that really focusing on the things that we together can do is more effective than you can do this, you can reduce your energy use, you can XYZ. This QR code is just something that I use to give out to people when they're like, I don't know what to do about climate change. It's just a list of kind of actions, it's conversation starters, it's lists of where you can move your money. What I think are really impactful actions that people can take and are quite useful if you don't know where to start, but that is specific to climate change and you can do it for anything, just meaningful solutions. Because people, like you saw before, people don't actually know what actions they can take. How can you take action if you don't know what it is? So the last one, measure impact. So just like you would measure any ecological intervention, see if it's working, you can also do that for any engagement, educational outreach, public awareness, all that stuff, all that type of stuff. You can measure if it's working, and if you can and you have the resources, you really should, because there is a growing body of work out there that demonstrate what works, what doesn't, and for who, but there can always be more, right? And there are many ways to do it, measure whether your thing had an impact on awareness, concern, behavior, whatever it is whatever your outcome was. And you can use quantitative methods. This is just an example, online surveys. There's actually a really good paper specific to conservation science, how you can do a really robust online survey and also what to watch out for. There's a lot of resources out there. But yeah, surveys, you can do one before and after your thing. You just do one after. There's so many options, but you can also do qualitative methods. You could do focus groups, interviews. You could just talk to people, see if it's working or not. A lot of, like I said before, it's these things, awareness, concern and behavior, people just kind of use them as very abstract concepts, like, yeah, it'll raise awareness. We'll just make people connected. They're like buzzwords almost that you throw around, but they can be measured. And in psychology, there's a lot of ways you can measure things like concern, emotion, where you can tangibly more or less measure how people are responding to an intervention. So it's really good to actually measure. Are you changing? Behavior is a tricky one, and I'm happy to talk about that later. It is a tricky one to measure, especially if it's online. Unless you can go and stalk everyone for a while, it's hard to know if people are changing their behaviors, but there are kind of ways around that and ways we can gauge if things are being effective. And that is pretty much it. I guess, yeah, my main takeaway was what I just said, that things like raising awareness are not just like airy fairy ideas, like we're going to raise awareness. You can do that, and you can raise awareness, you can measure it, you can increase knowledge. But if you want to change behavior, then you can also measure that. Like, this is stuff that can be measured. You can see if it's working. If it's not, you can respond to it. And you can change your approach and try and influence people that way. Yeah, thank you. Questions?